Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Self-Sovereign Podcast. My name is Justin Smith. I'm an independent documentary filmmaker. The Self-Sovereign Podcast is about all things related to autonomy and self-empowerment. One important aspect related to this is financial freedom. Most of us know that the current financial system is deeply corrupt. We've seen the banks bailed out multiple times, while ordinary people have to go through austerity and lose their jobs. We can't wait for politicians to improve the situation, especially when most of them are benefiting from it. So what can we do? Well, Bitcoin was intended to combat the injustices in the financial system. However, Bitcoin is currently heavily influenced by big business and the very financial institutions it was supposed to compete against. Many people are not aware that there is another cryptocurrency that is in some ways similar to Bitcoin, but in many ways technically superior. This particular cryptocurrency is almost always misunderstood since it doesn't have the same marketing effort behind it that Bitcoin has. The cryptocurrency I'm referring to is Monero, and I think it's worth looking at as a potential solution to government tyranny. That's what today's episode is about. Our guest is Douglas Tuman. Douglas and his wife Sunita host the popular podcast Monero Talk, which, as the name suggests, discusses all things related to Monero. Hi, Douglas, and welcome to the podcast.
What's going on, Justin?
So, could we start by talking about what the case is for crypto fundamentally, and why is it necessary to build a parallel economy?
Those are two big questions, but you're really getting at the heart of the matter, right? So, why does crypto matter? What's the value proposition of crypto? I often ask this on my show to my guests to try to really get at understanding why they're in crypto for the first place. And for me, I see the core value proposition of Bitcoin being separating money from state, as the Bitcoiners have coined so well. And, you know, not just in a sense of being able to control the money that's printed, you know, to basically turn off the spigot of fiat and decentralize the system so that monetary decisions aren't made by a cabal of people, but rather in a decentralized way. But even more so than that is the digital cash aspect of money, or the cash aspect of money, right? This idea that people use money as a tool to communicate value. And it's my belief that being able to do that in a peer-to-peer way is a fundamental right that people should have. Just kind of like the freedom of speech. There's this freedom to transact in my mind, in the way I look at the world, and what I think would lead us to the most liberated world we could have is a world where people can choose to transact with whoever they like in a way where they're not surveilled by a government that can dictate, you know, how they transact. And so cryptocurrency is really the invention of that in digital form. So a way for people to continue to use cash, but in digital form, and a digital cash that isn't controlled by any government or corporation, but is just a public utility that the entire world can use. That's what I really see as the value proposition of crypto. Peer-to-peer, uncensorable, resistant to surveillance, digital cash, and a system particularly that is built in a way where it's resistant to being co-opted by any centralized power, so that it's resistant to attacks from centralized powers that may want to try to co-opt it, whether it's large corporations or large governments. And so I don't know if you want me to get into it in this question, but the crypto that I personally think does that the best is Monero. We could get into more details as to why. And then to answer your second part of that question, which was why are we seeking to build a parallel economy? For me, it's not so much seeking to build a parallel economy. It's seeking to build, a peer-to-peer economy, which I guess starts as a parallel economy, but the hope is that becomes the economy of the future, right? And so we're trying to, the first step is to build a parallel economy among those that see the value in this type of free market enterprise, right, where people can use digital cash to transact freely. Started with that, and by doing that, we are, moving towards the what is ultimately what I see as the mission of cryptocurrency, which is to reduce the power of the state through the use of encrypted, decentralized technologies. And so by building a parallel economy outside of state control, you're building a system that is reducing the power of the state by a couple of different ways, but perhaps one of the, the one that may have the largest effect is the inability of states to perfectly control and tax that system and, siphon off power from it. And so that's why we're trying to build the parallel economy.
I think that a lot of people perhaps see the crypto endeavor, if you like, as something a little bit peripheral. But I personally see it at really at the core as a potential solution to many of the problems we're facing at the moment in society. Luckily, I think more and more people are starting to become aware a little bit of how the monetary system works and how it's basically an elaborate scam. And in particular, how inflation affects every single person in that, it's because of inflation that we've seen this increase in the number of hours that people need to work. So previously it would be one person from a household who would have to work full time. And then the second person started working part-time. Now you've often got both people or two people in the household working full-time. And even one of those people looking for a second part-time or full-time job as well. And this escalation in the number of hours that we have to work is mostly due to inflation, as far as I understand. And also, there's all kinds of other things, like one thing that Michael Saylor often talks about, this human right to own property, to keep the fruits of your labor so that you can plan for your future. And obviously, in a high inflation environment, then our money is obviously can be thought of as melting while it sits in the bank, devaluing all the time. So it takes away that human right to be able to plan for our own financial future. And the current system is also debt-based, of course, which means that the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and other central banks working in collaboration with governments can print as much money as they want and then use that money that's kind of created out of thin air to do whatever harm they want on the citizens of the country or citizens of other countries, to fund wars, to invest in the property market so ordinary people can't afford to buy property and all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, and by building a parallel economy, we're opting out of that fiat system. And so we're killing that fiat system by no longer giving it users. So we're stealing the users of the fiat system and porting them over to, a cryptocurrency economy that's not controlled by the state.
And the immediate kind of threat and danger, I think, is I think you briefly mentioned it just now, the central bank digital currency, which is really a key part in removing pretty much all of our personal freedoms.
Yeah, it's a very scary technology when you think about the repercussions, and it's not doesn't take a large stretch of the imagination, I think, for the average Joe to realize how far it can go, especially because of, recent history, right? With COVID, the entire world was locked down because of a virus that most definitely didn't justify locking down the entire world. And I think a lot of people realize it wasn't the virus, it was governments deciding to do that. And for whatever reasons, whatever happened there, a lot of people realize that, they are lacking liberty in this world and that the state has too much power. And so I think CBDCs is something that can be used to that end by the state to gain even more power and control over people. And I think given what we saw with COVID, the lockdowns, given what we saw with the strict vaccine mandates, and basically just the government recently trying to, wield control over people in a way that we haven't really experienced, at least in my lifetime, to that level. And so people have gotten a taste of it. And they could put the pieces together and realize that CBDCs is probably going to be abused by governments. And they see what's going on in places like China, right? Where it kind of, this totalitarian type of government already exists in a very real way. And they can easily imagine scenarios where if everybody is using this digital dollar, that the government would actually have control over their money. So when, the next economic disaster happens and they're going to give everybody their stymie checks, right? And send them all to every family in the U.S. and for every kid, you get 500 and whatever, every adult you get 1,000, they're going to send out the money to everybody. And then there's going to be this, stipulation, perhaps, that the only way you receive it is through a CBDC. Or maybe it's nicer. It's if you do receive it through a CBDC, you get 25% more. And so it's very easy for people to imagine not only how governments will eventually abuse it, but how they're probably going to be able, try to force people into adopting it. So it's scary and it's real, and I don't think it's a conspiracy theory or exaggeration to be very concerned about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're very open about the fact that so many countries are busy working on a central bank digital currency.
Yeah, they're working fast.
Yeah, and the terrifying thing for me is that it's quite easy to create a plausible explanation why we need to use that.
Sure.
You've got a global economy that seems to be on a knife edge. It could have a serious problem at any moment, it seems. And then if a significant problem does happen with the global economy, you can then propose, okay, we need this kind of reset of the global economy, and we need to. You've already used digital money. This is also just another form of digital money. And also at the same time, you've heard of Bitcoin. This is similar to Bitcoin, except this is better than Bitcoin because it's backed by the government and you can never lose this kind of version of Bitcoin. And then the final thing could be, we will give you, as you say, a stimmy check. We will give you like $5,000 or something to get you started in the new system. Yeah, all of that could sound quite plausible and quite tempting for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's happening. We might see some interesting outcomes though, where really what it's going to do is it's going to compete in the marketplace of money alongside cryptos, right? So I think you will see some governments test out some things that maybe we wouldn't. Maybe they're not actually going to live up to what they claim the features will be, but they may try to, for example, mimic digital cash and promise that it's private, right? So people be like, well, it's private, so why not? Why not use it? But are we going to be able to trust that? Probably not. And then maybe, I don't know, maybe they will experiment with bringing in some further guarantees to what the inflation rate, right? So trying to not as pure as crypto does it in an algorithmic way, but try to perhaps make it more decentralized, where it's not the Fed just deciding when we are printing. Maybe I'm just throwing that out there, right? I think you will see maybe some governments experiment with these ideas to making their CBDCs competitive with crypto and desirable. So it's interesting. And I think you let the best money win. I guess the concern just is that governments will have an unfair advantage because they're governments, right? They're the ones with the guns, and they have a lot to lose. So are they going to, in combination with the release of CBDCs, also make it more difficult to then use crypto, right? And crypto, this gets back to why Monero, because it's my belief that Monero is best suited for being resistant to any government co-opting, which is what I was basically saying when we were talking about the value proposition. And so, that's where that's why I think something like Monero is interesting, and is why it's the crypto that matters, because inevitably what this is going to come down to is a fight between cryptocurrency and the state. And we're going to need if crypto is going to work, it's going to have to be resistant to state co-opting. And I think the fact that Bitcoin is built on a transparent ledger opens up an attack surface on top of Bitcoin that essentially will allow governments to effectively defang Bitcoin. So it will exist. It will exist as crypto. People will own it. A lot of people will own it. Maybe its value will stay high. It might even, go higher, right? We'll get more people into it as it's going higher. But what will people really have at the end of the day? Maybe they'll feel like they have more wealth, but is the system controlled by the state effectively controlled by the state, because they're able to then track and trace and surveil everyone's transactions, and essentially tax them perfectly, just like they would with the CBDC, right? So it's not a CBDC, but because they have all this data on all the people using it, it could essentially function as a CBDC and be controlled by governments in that way.
I'm not sure how many people are aware yet of the scale of the operations that are involved in tracing crypto transactions. There are several companies which are owned by the conventional monetary system, the existing monetary system, and these are multi-billion-dollar operations with huge number of employees. And their one purpose is to find better ways of monitoring and tracing crypto transactions.
Yeah, and they're tied into the traditional system and the powers that be that run that system. They're making money off of chain analysis and simultaneously figuring out how to control cryptocurrency as they do it. So it's what the banks would want to use as a tool, because it's like the best tool they have against crypto and trying to maintain their power. And obviously the government, it's all the same. They're all in cahoots to maintain the centralized power they have. And so chain analysis is ramping up. Yeah, like you said, there's big companies. They're well funded. They're getting very good large contracts, and essentially it's government money. That's going to be funding a lot of these things. And it's creating this ecosystem between the chain analytics companies, the exchanges that essentially are forced to use them, and then the regulators that are making the rules that are forcing the exchanges to use them, right? And so it's like any other great corporate scam out there that does really well, like pharmaceutical companies, right? It's kind of like so they're being controlled by government. The regulators have incentive to create these regulations. The regulators are getting their money through lobbying from the chain analysis companies, essentially, and so it's creating this evil circle that's very dangerous, but it was very apparent that it was going to happen. And in Bitcoin land, hear people in Bitcoin being like, well, it's not, they shouldn't be doing this, no, that's not the point. It's not, you can't blame the chain analytics company. You can't blame the government. You can't blame regulators. You have to build something that's resistant to that. And so to not realize or to ignore the fact that Bitcoin's ledger is transparent and completely opens it up to this is either you're just lying to yourself because you own large Bitcoin bags and so you just want to perpetuate the system because you stand to profit from it, or I don't know. Actually, I think that's literally the only reason. I don't think there is another explanation for it, to be honest. Because I don't think people are too dumb to realize, because it's very easy to see the effects.
I think, we know, of course, that belief systems and branding and community, these are all powerful things as well. But of course, so that's brought us on to kind of going through what the potential problems with Bitcoin might be. So I think the privacy issue, of course, is a really key, important issue. And maybe during the time that Bitcoin gained in popularity, perhaps many of us were not aware just how adversarial our governments are. I think I remember listening to some presentations by people in the Bitcoin community, and they were openly acknowledging that this wouldn't work in a country that has a dictatorship. We now know, of course, that almost all of us are living in some kind of attempted dictatorship. Yeah. So, I
agree. I don't know what to say.
Yeah. So maybe you could give us a very brief description of how Monero solves that problem, the privacy problem, without going into too much technical detail, of course.
Yeah. So just in simple form, Bitcoin's ledger is transparent. Monero's ledger is obfuscated. So Monero uses the same basic blockchain tech that Bitcoin does, proof of work coin, nodes coming to consensus on the ledger. So whenever there's a transaction, it's broadcast and all these nodes agree to what that transaction is that's taking place, and then they're all agreeing to put it in the ledger and agreeing that that's the state of the ledger. And Monero does the same thing, except Monero's ledger is obfuscated, so you can't see who's sending what to whom. You can't see the sender, you can't decipher the receiver, and you can't determine the amount that's being sent. So effectively, what that does is it creates a more cash-like digital currency, as opposed to what Bitcoin is, which is really maybe more akin to like what Michael Saylor says, property, right? You could own a piece of property in Manhattan, it could be worth a lot. He loves to use the property analogy, but everybody knows you own the property and it's there and it's sitting there. And maybe it does take on value for whatever reason because everybody's agreeing that it's scarce. But it's not cash-like because you can see all the transactions that are taking place there as people buy and sell their property. And there's value to that, right? Like we said, it's, if we say it's digitally scarce and now you own a piece of this, and you own it in a way where it's perfectly known who the owner is, right? So there is value. There's definitely value in a system like that. And in a way where it's easy to if people try to manipulate or like steal or whatever thing, right? You like, because it's perfectly traceable, that you could easily catch people when they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing with their Bitcoin. But what you're missing out on is the cash-like features of Monero, and for all those reasons I talked about earlier is why that's probably a utility that we want, some way for people to transact in a cash-like manner on the internet.
And of course, the lack of privacy in Bitcoin leads on to the fungibility problem. Of course, fungibility being the simple fact that, for example, in the dollar system, $1 is always equal to $1. It doesn't matter what dollar bill you have. Everyone must legally accept that as being equal. But of course, in a cryptocurrency that is not private, then some amount of that cryptocurrency can be flagged as being problematic because it's been involved in or deemed to be involved in some transaction that the authorities don't like, and therefore those coins become less valuable than other ones, and you don't know whether you will receive those perceived to be less valuable coins into your wallet.
Right, like Manhattan property, right? It's not fungible, right? Each property has its own history, and that's the issue exactly. Because of Bitcoin's transparent ledger, all transactions have a history attached to them, which means by definition they're not the same because they're going to be interpreted differently due to their history.
The way I sometimes think about this is, if we take a dollar bill and put it underneath a microscope, we will probably find traces of cocaine, bacteria, viruses, and all kinds of things. But because we can't see that and we don't know the history of that dollar bill, it doesn't affect the value of it. But as you say, with something like Bitcoin, we can interrogate the blockchain and we can find out, where this Bitcoin has been and if it's so-called dirty.
And like we said before, not only can we, but there's this very strong business model that's tied into the established state and powers that be that want to track and trace cryptocurrency. So they not only can they do it, but they have this tremendous incentive to do it.
Yeah. And so I think the third key issue with Bitcoin, of course, is the scalability issue. So am I correct that Bitcoin can only do something like 4 or maximum 7 transactions per second? And obviously for a global financial system like Visa or something, you need at least something like 2,000 transactions per second.
Yeah. On chain, Bitcoin can only do a few. 7 transactions per second, whatever it is. I don't know, much more than that. And in Bitcoin, they have all their reasoning as to why that's okay. They want to build the Lightning Network or they've already built it on the second layer, and that's where they want their transactions to take place. Monero takes, this is another way in which Monero is different than Bitcoin. So not only is its ledger obfuscated, so transactions are private and fungible, but more towards the core value proposition of creating a decentralized money that can't be co-opted. Privacy is one element, and fungibility, but then you need security of the network, and Monero, and you need scalability, right? And Monero is architected in a way where its security and scalability are very elegantly combined. So Monero has dynamic blocks. Bitcoin has fixed blocks, and because of its fixed blocks, that's why you can only essentially fit 7 transactions in a block, or whatever. It effectively equates to 7 transactions per second, right? Because it only can fit so many transactions into a block every 10 minutes. Monero has a block every 2 minutes. The timing doesn't really matter much, but it is faster in that sense. But more so is it has dynamic blocks. So as more users use the protocol and make transactions, and as each one of them makes more transactions, but that the blocks dynamically get larger, so you can put more transactions into blocks as there's more usage. So effectively, over time, the chain can scale with the organic growth of its usage to really no end, because the blocks can keep getting larger. And also, the transactions effectively get cheaper as more users are stuffing transactions into a block, right? Because you have more fees that you can then take to give to the miners. So it scales in a very, very elegant way in that form, as opposed to Bitcoin. Monero also has what's called a tail emission. Bitcoin is capped at 21 million coins. Monero is nominally capped at around 18.6 million coins, and it hit that cap already. And now it's just emitting a steady supply of coins every 2 minutes. Whereas Bitcoin, once it hits its cap, there'll be no new coins emitted. And so in Bitcoin, the security of the network relies completely on the transactions. And like we said before, the transactions that go through the network are limited, because Bitcoin can only grow so much because of its fixed block size. So once again, getting back into the architecture of scalability, working with security, the Bitcoin blockchain has a potential issue with its future security, because if it can't scale to Visa level network on the base layer, it won't be able to sustain itself with the fees if all transactions are pushed to the fiat LN layer. So the tail emission in Monero, because of that, Monero, with its dynamic blocks, as blocks get larger and larger, as more people are using it and there's more transactions, the system, the miners will in perpetuity have an incentive to continue to secure the network, as they get paid more fees and transactions, and as they always get a fee paid through that tail emission that's always there.
I think the 21 million Bitcoins thing is quite fascinating in itself. I think we can appreciate where that comes from. The Bitcoin community has an almost evangelical approach to this, and just drawing the line in the sand and saying, you shall not pass. There can only be 21 million Bitcoins ever. But the two key issues, of course, is what you just mentioned in terms of the fees for the miners, but also it doesn't seem to take into account a certain amount of Bitcoin would be lost every year just in the normal usage of it. I mean, there's already a significant chunk of Bitcoin that can never be recovered because people threw their hard drive, away and things like that, tragically. So you do need a small amount of inflation in order to maintain the network. My understanding is that the low level of inflation in the Monero network is akin to the amount of new gold that's mined each year, or even a bit less than the amount of new gold that comes into the system.
Yeah, it's currently pretty much like it's at that rate, and it actually approaches zero over time. The inflation rate of Monero approaches zero over time because it's a steady tail emission, right? So the as more Monero are emitted, the total supply is going up, and so your inflation rate is going down and approaching zero, because the numerator, right, is getting larger, but the denominator is staying the same. And so it while people view the tail emission as being inflationary in perpetuity, it's actually not, because its inflation approaches zero over time. And so that's really important for people to realize. And so it's more abstract, right? Bitcoin's very simple. 21 million, it's capped. It's very easy for people to understand that why that's valuable, why that's scarce. And when they hear tail emission, they think, oh, there's an infinite amount of coins. But there's not. At any moment in time, there's only a fixed amount of coins, right? It hits, right now, if we took, how many coins you own, divided by the total amount, it's a fixed amount. It's not divided by infinity. There are not an infinite amount of coins. There'll only be an infinite amount of coins if we live for an infinite amount of time, right? So there is a fixed supply. And what people don't really, the real, back to the value proposition of crypto, one of these is the ability to prevent money being printed, right? That's really what it is. It's not that the supply is capped, but it's that nobody can take over the system and create more currency. But if the creation model is built into it, what the emission is, right? That's the real breakthrough, is that it has a predictable supply curve. And so Bitcoin's predictable supply curve ends at 21 million cap. But really the value there is knowing what the supply curve is, not what the supply curve is, right? All cryptos have different supply curves, and it really doesn't really matter, right? But it's knowing, or it's the market being able to know what the supply curve is, and to know in a guaranteed way that the supply curve will never change over time. It's fixed. And so I think there's even arguments to be made that Monero's supply curve is potentially more predictable and known than Bitcoin's, because Monero made the hard decision of adding a tail emission, sacrificing that gotta catch 'em all 21 million meme, because they knew it was impossible. Well, maybe they didn't know that, but a lot of the architects felt that there is a risk there with a system like Bitcoin's that's capped for those security reasons. And so instead of kicking the can down the road, Monero built this into its system so it will maintain security and perpetuity. And because of that, it will more likely maintain its fixed known supply curve over time, because there will never be a reason for the users to change it. And so in Bitcoin, everyone says 21 million, but you have heard discussions of people saying, will we one day need to potentially add a tail emission to Bitcoin? That is a discussion that really happens. There are those that say, that would never ever happen, but maybe there would be some fork. And if there was some fork, maybe the tail emission Bitcoin would thrive better than the fix for these reasons of the fact that it can maintain its security.
That kind of brings us on to one of the misconceptions about Monero, in that some people think that the amount of Monero that exists cannot be audited.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a concern. It's a difficult one to answer. But basically, Monero is as audible as Bitcoin is, right? When this all comes in terms of math and cryptography, right? With Bitcoin, you can physically essentially look at the ledger and add it up with the TI-82 calculator and say, this amount of Bitcoin exists. But you're trusting in the system still, right? You're trusting that the encryption hasn't been broken. There is this trust with Bitcoin. There's been inflation bugs in Bitcoin. They've happened, right? It's not an impossibility. In Monero, you have the same, like I said, it's the same basic architecture, but there's some added encryption that's required for you to not physically be able to see the sender and the receiver and the amounts. But the math that you're trusting in Bitcoin is essentially the same as the math that you're trusting in Monero. Math is math, right? Encryption is encryption. Monero uses more of it, and some of it might be more complicated, but it's highly vetted and trusted math. Whether it's 1 + 1 = 2 or some extremely complex formula that's doing encryption, very intelligent mathematicians are agreeing that it works and it checks out. So in Monero, while you can't physically, view the ledger and add it up with your calculator, you're trusting that the implementation of Monero's code and the encryption behind it are correct. And like I said, that's pretty much the same leap that you have to make with Bitcoin. You're also trusting that the math is correct, the code is correct, and it was correctly implemented. Otherwise, somebody maybe can crack a Bitcoin key and steal somebody's Bitcoin, right? There is trust there as well. So that's my kind of my simple answer for that, without getting into more detail. But for somebody who's kind of a layman in crypto, I think that's all you really need to understand, that math is math, crypto is crypto. If you think, if it's if it's an open source project, there's a lot of developers working on it, then that's really what you're putting your trust in, right? You're trusting in this general concept of crypto, and that if intelligent mathematicians and cryptographers get together and build it, that it is theoretically possible. And so that's the leap of faith you take with Bitcoin, and that's the same leap of faith you take with Monero. It's just not as obvious to be able to see the amounts, but you're still, the system is auditing it for you.
I think this has been discussed in quite a lot of detail on one of the forums on Reddit. I think some developers have put all the details there to deal with this objection that sometimes comes up.
Yeah, it's discussed a lot, but basically, the software is doing its job. You could type in the software at any moment, how many Monero exist, but you're trusting that the software is properly implemented and it's giving you the correct response because of that, right? And then the nodes, every time a transaction takes place, the nodes are validating that the encryption hasn't been broken. They're coming to consensus that the protocol hasn't been broken, and then we're all agreeing on what the state of the protocol is at that time, and that that's where the validation is coming. It's through the protocol itself, similar to Bitcoin, but like in Bitcoin, where there's other things that are behind the veil in terms of not being able to just, as a person, look at it and see it. In Monero, there's the amounts are veiled additionally. So just an additional trust in the math that requires that, in the most simplest form as to what it comes down to, what the basic concept is.
Yeah, sure. Maybe we can talk briefly about the difference in the way the mining is done between Bitcoin and Monero, because obviously Monero has resisted the ASIC computer, the large computer, being able to mine it.
Yeah, so Monero has an ASIC resistant proof of work. Bitcoin originally was mined by CPUs. It was people running their computers. That's how it started. That's what it was meant to be. That's how Satoshi, originally saw it. Kind of like a one CPU, one vote. But over time, people invented better hardware that can mine it better than a general CPU, and they had the incentive to do so because they wanted to mine more Bitcoin. And so they built application-specific hardware that's better at mining Bitcoin than your general CPU. It's more efficient at doing it. So CPUs in Bitcoin really can't compete with ASICs at all. They can't compete, at all. So it's created this centralization in terms of the manufacturers of these ASICs. And in very many ways, the corporations that are capable of getting their hands on these ASICs and creating these large ASIC farms that have access to cheap electricity. So you have these large behemoth mining companies that control the network. In Monero, it also started as a CPU mineable crypto, and part of its design thesis was to prevent the creation of ASICs. So in the early days of Monero, that was done actually through forking the code and changing the proof of work every so often. And obviously that wasn't the end goal. It was always known in Monero that that wasn't the sustainable way of doing things or a desirable one, because it can lead to centralization. But rather creating a proof of work that essentially did that on its own through an algorithm, so that effectively the ASIC of Monero becomes the CPU. And as the CPU evolves, there is no added efficiency that you can get out of creating a quote unquote better CPU. So all CPUs, kind of compete equally to mine Monero. And so that creates a more decentralized system where essentially anybody with access to a CPU can theoretically fairly compete. Obviously, if somebody has more CPUs than you, they're going to be able to mine more, but they'll never have that a large efficiency over the general population's CPUs, to the point where it makes sense for them to have large warehouses of these CPUs that are doing it in a better way than what the rest of the population is able to do on their own. So it theoretically won't lead to as much centralization of the mining.
So in the interests of balance, we should also probably discuss some of the areas that Bitcoin potentially still has an advantage over Monero. So the thing that's often talked about, of course, is simply the network effect that Bitcoin has. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think, the network effect is really where it's at. This is where I personally start to sound like a maxi when I talk about Monero in this respect, by saying that it's the most used digital cash for when people actually need to transact privately. And that's a very real thing. If most people are using this one protocol, then chances are, they're going to continue to use it. And network effect is, scientifically proven, right? As more nodes, Metcalfe's law, as more nodes enter the network, the network itself becomes more valuable, and it's positive feedback loop, and it continues to grow. So yeah, I think there's a ton of validity to that statement. I guess what I would and I think that will have a very large effect, a tremendous effect, obviously, on the broader market. And because of that, you'll have just a few winners, very few large winners at the end of the day. And then ultimately what it finally consolidates into, I don't know, but there's going to be certainly a period, I think, where you'll have a couple of behemoth cryptos that are tweaked in little different ways where it makes sense for them to exist, and that they offer different utility. And so, like I said before, maybe Bitcoin's utility is being number go up digital property, that you're not getting complete liberty. And, there's obviously a lot of value in liberty, right? It's like, would you rather own gold, or would you rather own old gold that the government doesn't know you have and can't see how you're using it? But you probably also want the perfectly traceable gold if it's, not me personally, because I'm extremist in my views, and I want to greatly weaken the state through crypto. But most people don't even really think along those lines, and that's why they're attracted to number go up. And and a lot of people say they agree with those other lines, but at the end of the day, it's really number go up that drives them, because people are people, and they're greedy, and they want to survive, and they want to make money, and that's why that's why Bitcoin's network effect has worked so well. It's been a great system for bootstrapping crypto, especially because of the meme of the 21 million limited supply. And so, yeah, network effect is a very real thing. And I think Monero is gaining, or has, I would arguably say, has the first mover advantage, and is currently the winner in the true digital cash space for that use case. And there'll be others, maybe Ethereum things, but I'm most interested in the digital cash use case. So I wouldn't even want to name other cryptos because I don't study them close enough. But I do think we're going to have a protocol that's really good at that. And I don't think Bitcoin serves that purpose, is providing that utility, but it has network effect for the utility that it does provide.
Kind of related to the network effect of Bitcoin, even though we were just discussing the difference in the mining, and that Monero is potentially better because anyone can still mine Monero. You don't need a large investment. Literally anyone can just start using their laptop or even a smaller device than a laptop to mine Monero. However, I was impressed to see how dynamic the mining network has been in the past with Bitcoin. So, for instance, when in China they banned Bitcoin mining, I was really impressed by how quickly the operation sprung up in North America and other parts around the world. So that gave me a little bit of hope for Bitcoin, to see this really dynamic response to regulation in a particular country.
Yeah, I saw that as the positive twist on that situation. Me being, I guess, the pessimist, I was concerned that a government overnight was able to stop Bitcoin mining in their country and basically shut off 70% of the hash power overnight. Yes, it popped up somewhere else, but did it pop up somewhere else where the government is now controlling those miners? Yes, they're run by private corporations, but are they effectively, maybe that government's not saying you can't do it anymore. Maybe they're saying, oh no, you could do it, but you got to follow all these rules and you listen to us. But don't worry, you guys will make tons of money, but you're going to follow these regulations. And so that's what concerns me, right? That trying to prove that you could shut down miners. So if you could shut down miners, maybe you could also co-op miners. So you don't have to even shut them down, but you just influence them.
Well, the other thing, of course, is we saw that because you have these large mining pools with Bitcoin, and they're of interest to the conventional large financial institutions like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and Fidelity, the finance institutions that own pretty much every, significant portion of pretty much every organization in North America. And for a while, I'm not sure what the current situation is, but they were buying significant shares in the largest Bitcoin mining pools. So they effectively were getting to a point where they control a significant amount of the hash power of Bitcoin. And although that would be extremely unlikely to get to the point where they could do something like a 51% attack, I believe that it is still highly significant, because the way sort of the improvements work with Bitcoin and the voting system, if there was an essential upgrade that was needed to keep the network going, then those financial institutions that control a significant amount of the mining operation could simply could vote against the upgrade. And that could be a significant problem in the future for Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so with Monero has, Bitcoin has it too, but it hasn't really caught on. Monero has P2 pool. So this was invented by someone in the Monero community. This version of it for Monero, it allows for a pool to happen where we should quickly explain the concept of the pool, right? So it makes more sense for miners to collaborate and pool their resources and share in the profits in proportion to how much mining they're contributing, so that they all get a more steady supply of crypto. over time, as opposed to kind of waiting till you win. Basic concept of a pool. But the downside is, because of that, the incentive is for that pool to just get larger and larger, because, it makes sense for it to get larger and larger, right? It will just keep growing. P2 pool is a pool, so people can pool their hashing power. They share in the rewards, but the pool itself doesn't have essentially control over the voting power from the miners. They still maintain that. And so it's a nice little tricky technology that allows, effectively, P2 pool, we'd want it to get as large as possible, or we want maybe a couple of different competing P2 pools, but they're not centrally controlled pools run by, people that are making rewards off of running them.
How does the process work within the Monero community in terms of upgrades to the network?
Very similar to Bitcoin. It's an open source project. Proposals are essentially, pitched to the community. They're discussed among the devs. It's all open. You see the chats take place, and then they collaborate, and they come up with an implementation of what the idea was that they want to do. And the implementation is, and when I say they, it's these developers. A lot of them are anonymous. Some of them are known. Some of them are making money through requesting funding from the community. Say, oh, I want to make this improvement, and that potentially gets funded by the community if the community likes the proposal. And the devs collaborate, and they do it in an open source fashion. Sometimes money is raised to audit, if changes are being made, especially the cryptography, to do outside audits. And then the code is implemented, and it's up to the nodes and the users to decide if they want to adopt the changes, and the miners, right? And so, similar to Bitcoin, it functions like that. There's no dev tax in Monero. It's all open source, and people point to that and say, well, who really controls it? But it's the same issue. It's the same issue as Bitcoin, which is why I think it's important for a crypto, and I said this earlier, for it to have a very robust development community run by, volunteers and people that are passionate about the project, and outside companies that are putting money in because they want to use the protocol. It's very important that the development be very robust, because that leads to the decentralization of the development, which, if you don't have decentralization of development, you essentially have centralized architects that are making a system that can benefit them.
One thing that we didn't discuss earlier was the history of Monero, where Monero comes from. A number of let's say Bitcoiners have said to me in the past that it's a fork of Bitcoin, and it's not really a fork of Bitcoin as far as I understand.
Monero is its own protocol. So there's the Bitcoin protocol. Then a couple of years later was something that was invented. It was called the Crypto Note Protocol. And it was created by Nicholas Van Saberhagen. Some people theorize maybe it's some of the same people that worked on Bitcoin. And the white paper for the Crypto Note Protocol basically calls out the Bitcoin protocol. It says, we're making these changes where we see shortcomings with Bitcoin. And this was one of the earliest cryptos to be launched. One of the earliest non-Bitcoin cryptos to be launched. Those things like Namecoin, and the Crypto Note Protocol was a breakthrough, and basically it proposed adding these cryptographic proofs that would allow you to obfuscate certain parts of a transaction to make it more private, and all the other things we spoke about. Not all the other things, because Monero has also since evolved, but some of the base architecture that made Monero the private fungible version of Bitcoin. But yeah, it's absolutely its own protocol. And in fact, I don't know if you're familiar with Xano. It's another cryptocurrency. It's another privacy coin. But the creator of Xano claims to have been the part of the group that implemented the first version of CryptoNote. And so Andre is his name. I've interviewed him before on Monero Talk. I highly recommend checking that out. It's very interesting. I don't really, I can't really validate everything he says, but there seems to be, very good evidence of this fact that he was old school part of CryptoNote, of the original CryptoNote builders and devs. And so he's going to he's going to be at the conference in Monerotopia. So it's very, very interesting. But yeah, it has its own origin story, similar to Bitcoin's, in that it was an anonymous group of people, and it was put out there in the interwebs and adopted. Different than Bitcoin in that it had this tumultuous early period where there was infighting and a couple of essentially different versions, and then a winner appeared, which was the group of people that were doing it in the most genuine, non-scammy way. And so it has a very interesting origin story. It's very similar to Bitcoin's.
Okay. Then maybe we could discuss a couple of things related to the wider adoption of Monero or any other really digital cash system, peer-to-peer digital cash system. And first one is probably related to the price and the price fluctuations, which is kind of a barrier to wider adoption, because when you approach newbies about saying, hey, why don't you accept Monero in your small business? They will say things like, how can I convert it into real money? And also they'll be concerned about it losing value before they've converted it into their perceived real money.
Yeah, that's a concern that pretty much all cryptos share, except for quote unquote stable coins, which is interesting, right? We said like CBDCs are going to try to compete against these things, and that's something that a CBDC does better than a genuine cryptocurrency. It's quote unquote stable, obviously, because it's controlled by the government for all these fiat reasons we're talking about. So yeah, true cryptocurrencies are not quote unquote stable because they're built outside of the government. They're obtaining their own value and they're being measured against the current system, right? And so the market is deciding what the value is, and it's fluctuating at any given time. And obviously it's going up in value because of Metcalfe's law as more people are using the network, and it's becoming more valuable, and the asset itself is limited in supply. And because of that, you're not going to have a quote unquote stable thing until perhaps it gets so large and enough people are using it that it really has it reached its ultimate value among society. And at that point, it won't change much, only with the growth of the economy itself. And so we're in that growing period. So for a vendor who wants to accept a crypto, I guess, the early adopters are those that, like me, that see value in the system and see it as an investment and are willing to take that risk and accept crypto. It's actually one of the best ways to obtain good crypto, right? Is sell something for it, do a service for it, allows you to get it in a more KYC, a non-KYC way, right? And you're obtaining crypto. But the risk is the value fluctuates. So number one, I guess be careful about which crypto you're deciding to accept if you're going to accept it and hold it. But then obviously there are ways to sell it and turn it into a stable coin or to fiat. So there's that. But then it's like, well, why am I doing this? I might as well accept Venmo. I might as well accept a credit card, not have to deal with the hassle and the risk of accepting it, turning it into. And so there's only two reasons. One, you ultimately see value in this system, so you see it as an investment. Or two, there's a utility in it and a reason why you should be accepting it. And this, not to sound like the ultimate Monero maxi, but this is why, once again, I find Monero more interesting, because for this use case, there is utility, right? Beyond credit cards, beyond Venmo, that Bitcoin doesn't provide, right? Why should I use in fact, in Bitcoin, most people don't even want to spend it, right? It's part of its value, utility has just become hodling, so they don't even want to spend it. In Monero, there's this incentive to want to accept Monero because you're accepting a private, untraceable crypto. Just like if you show up at your local restaurant in your neighborhood and they say, you mind if I pay cash? Like, of course. In fact, we'll give you a discount if you pay cash. We don't want you to use credit card. Why? Because cash is king, right? It's untraceable, and people want cash. So if you can, if there's a cash-like thing for the internet, there's a reason for vendors to want to accept that over credit card and Venmo. So that's the incentive for, I think, the innate incentive for a vendor to want to do it. And then the same goes for the person spending the crypto. Once again, it's not that easy. There are some hurdles. You work when you send it. Oh, did I send it to the right? There's things like, why not just use your credit card? Why not just use Venmo? No fees. There's no fees. Crypto, there are fees. Even if they're small, there's fees. So why the hell are you going to use this complicated thing? Because you're getting the utility of cash. If people don't know that you made that transaction, it's not being surveilled, it can't be seen, and there's value in that, and people not being able to see how you're using your money.
I think of it simply in terms of every time you do a Monero transaction, it's kind of a vote for freedom and liberty.
Yeah, it's a vote for that, but it's not even it's not even an activist thing. It's bringing you value. Every time you spend in a way where your transactions are obfuscated, I think you're getting more value out of that transaction, because you don't have governments and corporations that are able to surveil that data and extract value from you. Why are they doing that? Because they have the incentive, because they want to extract value from you. And if they can't extract that value. It's the same as being on the internet, right? So like if you're on Facebook was always the example. I don't think people use Facebook anymore, but people use Facebook because it was great. It was free, and you're socializing. You're on it 24/7, but it's not free. You're the product, right? And so with crypto, it's the same thing. With money, it's the same thing. If it's free to transact on Venmo, you're probably the product.
And are there any interesting projects ongoing in the Monero ecosystem? How are things progressing?
A lot of interesting things. Monero sees privacy and crypto in general as a constant battle. So back to its value prop, right? It wants to be incorruptible, and that's a constant battle. You don't build something that's incorruptible from day one. I think some people in Bitcoin like to think that was the case. But as genius as Satoshi was, and him or the group that did it, the things they were able to foresee and how they architected Bitcoin is amazing. But to think that they built it in such a way that it really doesn't need to be tweaked at all, much if at all, is absurd, given the dynamics of the system that it's up against. And so Monero evolves over time. There's always new. There's what we call them updates to Monero. They used to be every 6 months, and now they're about every year, 2 years, and over time there'll be less and less of them as the protocol ultimately ossifies, but not until it's gained enough power where it no longer essentially needs to, and it's reached its ultimate form. And so some of the big changes are in the way the privacy works, in scaling, so in making transactions more efficient over time. So it becomes essentially cheaper in terms of like bandwidth and processing power to send a transaction, right? the transactions get more efficient over time, because there's, a Monero transaction is a heavier transaction than a Bitcoin because of its privacy features, the encryption, the processes that the nodes need to go, that basically processes that need to happen to maintain the obfuscation of Monero. It comes with a cost, but that there's changes being made over time for that cost to drop, so it becomes more efficient.
The cost, just to be clear, the cost is associated with the amount of data, the data storage in the blockchain. Is that correct? Yeah.
Correct. The transactions are effectively larger.
Yeah.
Although apples to apples, if a Bitcoin, you can't really compare a transparent Bitcoin transaction to a perfectly fungible Monero transaction. It's comparing a quote unquote fungible Bitcoin transaction, or a private Bitcoin transaction, really, because it just can never really be fungible, but a private one for those use cases, to a private Monero, which is Monero in all states. And so a private Bitcoin transaction comes with additional costs. If you want to transact privately in Bitcoin, your transactions are going to be heavier because you're going to have to go through extra steps. You're going to have to basically send a couple of transactions to achieve privacy, which is achieved in one Monero transaction. So that's a good point to get out there. But over time, in addition to that, so even just ignoring the apples to apples, Monero does evolve over time and it becomes more efficient. So, it will effectively be able to scale as more people use it. So one of the biggest upgrades is going to be of the ring signature component of Monero. So Monero, it uses three main features. It uses stealth addresses to obfuscate the receiver of a transaction. It uses confidential transactions to obfuscate the amount. And it uses ring signatures to obfuscate who the sender is. And of those three, ring signatures is really the weakest technology. Stealth addresses is encryption. It's very strong. Confidential transactions, same thing. Actually, it was invented by Bitcoiners, Adam Back. Stealth addresses was actually proposed by Satoshi in the Bitcoin forums before the crypto note protocol was released, which then described that technology. And ring signatures was also described by Satoshi in the Bitcoin farms, which was also then put into this crypto note protocol that came out not much further after, which added it. But the ring signature portion of Monero admittingly needs improvement. It works today as digital cash, but if it wants to continue to be able to prevent adversaries from tracing who the sender is, unraveling who that is, it's going to need to upgrade. And it's already made leaps and bounds, but one of the things it's going to be doing is adding something called Seraphis, which is Ko is the leader of that project. He's going to be at Monerotopia actually giving a presentation on that. And that's probably the biggest technological thing that's in the pipe for Monero. And it's very exciting. And once it's added, it's in addition to adding privacy for the foreseeable future in a more guaranteed way for just the sender, right? Like that, I got to make that clear. The amounts are obfuscated. That's fine. Nobody's even thinking of touching that anytime soon. Stealth addresses, same thing. It's just this ring signature thing for obfuscating the sender, which works today as digital cash, but in being aware of the fact that our adversaries are improving over time, that component needs to make an upgrade in time so we could stay ahead of the adversaries. And Seraphis takes us kind of leaps and bounds from where we are to where at the point where we really won't have to worry about adversaries in that respect for quite some time. And then probably beyond that, we will completely deprecate ring signatures. And Seraphis is a step in that direction because it's allows Monero to be more modular in terms of how the sender is obfuscated, so that it could get that part, the ring signatures, can essentially easily be deprecated at some point in the future when a better technology based on full encryption can be swapped in there. So that's probably the biggest thing that's going on in Monero right now.
Cool. Just to be clear for people listening, that so far as we know, no one's been able to, let's say, crack the privacy of Monero. Is that correct?
Yeah, we just did a very comprehensive show on this yesterday. I had Seth for privacy on. We streamed it on a Twitter Spaces. I do the shows Monero Talk every week. Monero Talk is like kind of the style that we're doing right now. Long form interviews, and then I also do a Monerotopia show on the weekends. That's like a live show with me and Sunita, my wife. We've been doing this for years, and we have the community involved. But where was it go? Oh yeah, so I had Seth on, and we very thoroughly went through the FUD against Monero in terms of people hypothesizing that perhaps it can be traced by chain analysis companies. And the reason we touched on that, it's been touched on many times in Monero. It's very openly discussed in Monero. There are some of the most watched or respected videos and content that's been put out with regards to Monero has been covering those topics by the Monero devs themselves. Breaking Monero is the series. I recommend people Google that, check that out. And particularly the scenario I spoke about with Seth was something called poison outputs. Won't get into the details. I mean, I can, but we spent the whole 2 hours on it last night. But the bigger picture, or the reason why it resurfaced as discussion, because there was a new surge of FUD against Monero, because there was a book that came out by crypto journalist Andy Greenberg. I'm sure you've come across his articles in Wired. He's been reporting on crypto for many years. One of the most long-standing journalists, very respected, and he writes really interesting, engaging stuff about crypto, and he really understands it well. He put out this book about the traceability of cryptocurrency and really concentrated on Bitcoin and talked about all these things we talked about today with the chain analytics companies and regulators and how the ecosystem and how they're using the chain analysis companies to fight crime and all the examples of it. And he recently had an interview with Laura Shin on her podcast Unchained, and they talked about the book. And there's a couple of clips in that interview where he basically strongly alludes to his belief that Monero is traceable based on his research and his understanding of what he's saying in the space. And so that's where the FUD was coming about from recently. I wanted to get Andy on my show. Hopefully I'll get him on. And so that's why I had Seth on and we talked about it. But I highly recommend watching that episode, and it breaks down the FUD in a way that you understand it. But no, I do not think Monero is traceable. And the things that Andy referenced have been discussed in great detail in the Monero community, and the consensus is that chain analysis companies are not capable in a deterministic way of tracing Monero.
Cool. I'll definitely include a link to that discussion.
And when I say of tracing Monero, only the sender, definitely not amounts and receiver. Just in this small potential attack way, given the decoy ring signature of Monero. But even with that flaw being known, it is theorized that Monero is well ahead of the ability of chain analysis companies to be able to do something like that.
Cool. Douglas, thanks so much for taking the time today. For people to follow you, then, is that just simply a case of subscribing to you on YouTube for Monero Talk?
Yeah, just Monero Talk on YouTube, Douglas Tuman on Twitter. And we also do the Monerotopia show, but that's just on the Monero Talk YouTube channel.
Cool. And then there's the conference coming up in Mexico.
Yes, conference coming. Very excited about it. We did one last year in Miami. That was our first Monerotopia. and we're doing our second one in Mexico City in May. Going to be starting on the 5th of May. Just happens to be Cinco de Mayo. I know it's very cringe to show up as a bunch of gringos in Mexico City and celebrate Cinco de Mayo, but it just happens to be on Cinco de Mayo is the first day. That's the welcome party, and then there's going to be talks and craziness all day on the 6th and all day on the 7th. It was crazy last year. We've packed the house with Monero speakers for the day. We're going to do the same thing down in Mexico. And then in addition to that, we're going to have a lot of other privacy tech projects that are going to be down there presenting as well. All in the name of living up to Monero's ethos of being a truly open source project where where there isn't a religion in terms of the belief in Monero, but it's treated more as a science project. And so it's studied as a technology among other technologies and compared and contrast. So that's why we're being as open to other projects as we can, especially privacy tech projects, and trying to learn from them and collaborate and really bring that community together, which ultimately is a very small community. If you take you take Zcash and Monero, those that in Bitcoin that use Samurai, and all these advocates for true digital cash is a small percentage of crypto, and crypto itself isn't that large on a global scale in terms of people. So we're trying to unite those people at Monerotopia.
And I guess it's something we didn't mention was the challenge that Monero has within the crypto media, because I understand that the major players in the crypto media are either original Bitcoiners or they're from the conventional financial world, and so the focus or the interest, at least most of the interest, would be on financial investments and, as you say, number go up technology. So that I think that's seems to be one of the reasons why Monero has struggled a little bit to get to the forefront of people's minds.
Sure. And that's all part of the network effect, right? That's what you have to overcome. So I do think Monero has very strong organic growth that's taking place. And it's exciting to see. I just bought, well, I can't even say it right now because Sunita's listening. Because I bought her a surprise for our anniversary, and I used Monero to do it. And that's the thing. I could pretty much get anything I want these days using Monero. Find the right people. They understand the value and the utility in it. They're willing to trade their service or their product for Monero. So it's very exciting. And that's going to be a big part of Monerotopia too. Building out the parallel economy. We're actually going to have a marketplace from Mexico City of local Mexican vendors that are going to be there for the 2 days. We're going to onboard them to Monero, so they'll be there the entire 2 days, selling food things, but also selling wares and handmade things that people can buy with Monero. And then a lot of the in addition to talking about the protocol and the development and other crypto projects, we're going to have speakers talking about agorism. We're going to have speakers just talking about, philosophically the importance of the digital cash. We're going to have people talking about how we practically can start building out a parallel economy and showcasing the projects that are already doing that, doing it well. I should say it's Monerotopia.com is where you can get tickets. That's another thing too. Unlike the Bitcoin, I saw there was a tweet from the Bitcoin conference, price is about to go up, and it's they're already at 600 or something and going to 700. Monerotopia, it's $99, and it's a 2-day great conference. It's not about the number go up stuff. It's people just cypherpunks and people that are interested in that ideology just hanging out. And it should be cool. We're going to try to post a virtual conference ticket as well. We did that last year. We just haven't put it up yet. But I hold that off because I really would rather people come down there. So I try to hold that off to the end. But yeah, if people can't make it, we're going to put a virtual ticket, which was very popular last year. But if you can make it, it's well worth it. Just being there among these people and feeling that energy and getting excited about the tech.
That's great. Thanks a lot. Thanks for taking all the time today. Brilliant. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, man. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Self-Sovereign Podcast. If you found the information useful or interesting, then subscribe to the podcast and share it with others. Also, please check out the links in the description, which are related to what was discussed today. Thank you.